So one of the presenters you've already met, John Wack from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I am John Gerlai. I work on the common data formats, and I am also co-author of all four of the common data formats. I started work back in 2012 under Matt Masterson when I worked for the Ohio Secretary of State's office. And he got me involved in this NIST effort, and it was geeky and it was cool, and it was right up my alley. When I was at the Ohio Secretary of State, I actually worked on implementing both the election results reporting common data format as well as the voter records interchange common data format. John, is there anything you want to finish up in regards to the overview?
The only other thing I just want to say again is a big thank you to the wonderful people who contributed to all this. I won't mention people by name, but many of them are on the call. So a great thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, John.
Yes, thank you very much. So one housekeeping note is that everybody is in listen-only mode. If you'd like to pose a question, you can do so in the chat whenever you'd like, or you can wait until the Q&A section, which will be at the end of the presentation. So I guess I should start by saying that XML is a big, complicated topic. Like I said earlier, we're not going to cover everything that you could potentially see in an XML feed. What we want to do is get you acclimated with XML so that you can read a feed, interpret a feed, and potentially create your own feeds. So the common data formats are described in terms of concepts. What is an election? What's a ballot style? How do these things relate to one another? And that's very good and useful. But when we're talking about implementation, we have to talk about more of the technical details. And that's why we're discussing today XML, which is the machine representation of the common data format. We also support JSON, which is another very popular format for data transfer. We chose today to talk about XML. XML looks a little bit like that. There we go. So what is XML? It's not a programming language. I'm not going to try to get you to code. It's a markup language, and it gets that name because it was originally designed to mark up text documents. It represents data as a tree. So you start with one big concept, and then you break it down into smaller and smaller concepts. Different common data formats have a different root concept. So in election results reporting, we talk about the election report. In cast vote record, we talk about the cast vote record report, or a group of cast vote records, etc. One of the key features of XML is, and it's not a prescriptive format, so it doesn't actually come with any vocabulary of its own. So we, as members of the NIST EAC public working groups, came up with that vocabulary, and we incorporated a number of terms already in use in the Voting Information Project. It's meant to be both machine readable and human readable, though it's debatable how human readable it is. It is purely text-based, though, so you can open it up in Notepad or whatever your viewer of choice is, and you should at least be able to inspect the XML. So here's an example of a fictitious tag set, and this is valid XML, by the way. So if I wanted to represent today's webinar in XML, how would I do that? So we have the root tag, which is webinar, and then I have the topic, of today's webinar, as well as the start and end time. And, how the tag set is constructed is really up to the people constructing it. So we, in the NIST EAC working groups, decided upon certain standards and conventions as far as how we're going to represent dates and times and extensibility, enumerations, etc. But really, XML at its core is just punctuation. You can represent whatever you'd like so long as you adhere to the syntax of XML. So today we're going to talk about the building blocks of XML, tags, attributes, and of course data. I'll give a brief demonstration of how you can view XML files, talk a little bit about future webinars on the horizon, and then get to your questions. So tags are the building block of any vocabulary. And like I said, they are hierarchical. So you start with a root and then you can put things inside them. So, you could have an election, for example, and say inside that election we have contests, we have candidates. That's an example from election results reporting. As far as the syntax is concerned, it is case sensitive. So, voter is not equal to shouting voter. It's not equal to, lowercase voter. And the angle brackets are delimiters. So if you look at the right there, you'll see that we have a start tag and an end tag, and we'll get a little bit more into the details of that. So tags need to come in pairs, or at least they need to be opened and closed. So the first example on the top right shows a open tag and a closed tag. The open tag starts with a less than symbol and then the name of the tag followed by a greater than symbol. If we had data, we would put the data in between where the two angle brackets come to a point. In this case, we don't. And then the end tag is much like the start tag, except right after the less than symbol is a /. And that's the extent of the syntax for tags. Now, there are edge cases where you don't actually need to store data in your tag, particularly when you're using attributes, which we'll get to shortly. In that case, you can have a self-closing tag, which is at the lower right-hand side of the screen. And that starts with a less than symbol, the name of the tag, a space, and then a / followed by a greater than symbol. This isn't particularly common in the common data formats, but it is possible. So I thought we'd include it. So here's a bit more complete example of a XML instance. This isn't necessarily a valid one, but it approximates what you would see in election results reporting common data format. You start with the root tag, and then you nest below that things of interest. Some of those things can repeat, like candidates or contests. And normally you would indicate that things are nested by tabbing out or indenting those nested items, and they should pair up. That's not required by XML. It's completely up to you. You could have it all on one line, but if you want to have a readable file that people won't get angry when they look at it, this is a pretty standard convention. And the nested tags tend to represent some sort of relationship between what's nested and the parent. So, a candidate is in an election, or a ballot name belongs to a particular candidate. So those nesting relationships show certain semantics of, part relationships as well as like ownership relationships. So like I said earlier, each CDF has its own set of tags or vocabulary and rules for their use. That's the value add of the CDF specifications. That's what they will tell you about. How can I use the concepts in the CDF? What are the relationships? What are the constraints? But as far as the representation goes, that's either going to be in XML or in JSON. Since the CDFs are not in terms of XML or JSON, but in terms of UML, that's why I thought it was doubly important to have a webinar like this to provide an introduction to implementation. When we started with the election results reporting common data format, we borrowed broadly from the Voting Information Project, which had already been in the space for a number of years and was very mature. So if you look at 1500-100, which is the election results reporting CDF, you'll see a lot of elements and attributes that you would find in a modern VIP 5.x feed. So now we'll get into attributes. Attributes are a difficult concept for some people because they don't necessarily translate to tabular data that you'd find in a relational database. At least the distinction isn't there. You know, a relational database is pretty flat. You have columns and you have rows. However, in a relational database, you often have metadata like create date, create time, create user, maybe an IP address. All that metadata can be stored separately from the core data that is being conveyed, and that's what attributes are used for. So in this example down here, I have the webinar tag, and then created by is the attribute, and then my name is the value. So generally speaking, the CDFs only use metadata in a few places. They use it when you need to specify the language of a piece of text. That could be a ballot name, especially a ballot measure, where the text is going to be vastly different depending on the language. And then metadata about external files like a signature image. We also use it for what we call object identifiers, which in the relational model you would consider like keys or foreign keys, things that relate different data objects together. I would mention that the CDF specifications are in terms of the unified modeling language. That's the diagramming language that we use to create both the XML and the JSON schemas. UML describes everything in terms of attributes. Those attributes aren't XML attributes. They can actually become either XML tags or XML attributes depending on how we've constructed the UML model. So if that's confusing, I'm sorry. It's also out of scope for today's talk. But if you want to understand that a little bit more, there's a link to an explainer on that. So we want to store the data. I mean, having a framework is great, but we need to be able to actually convey data. And XML is great at that. And that's what sits between the 2 points of the angle brackets. So in this example, we have an address line, and between that delimiter, we have 123 Grove Lane, Edgar, Wisconsin, 54426, and then we have an end tag. So in between those two delimiters is our data, and that data is the address line. I would note the tags can either contain more tags. So in the case of an election, we might want to say, okay, an election is made up of candidates, and those candidates would also be tags. Or they can contain just character data, like in this example. So we start with the tags. Those tags form a pair. Between those tags is our data, and optionally we can have attributes. I am actually going to open it up for questions very quickly before I continue, just to make sure everybody's got a chance to ask questions. So if anybody wants to ask questions, hit *7, or you can unmute using the interface if you're using the web interface. Are there any questions? Okay, well, I'll keep going then. So most things in XML are optional. And what do I mean by most things in XML? I mean, most of the features of XML that I've gone through are optional. Really, all you need are tags. Certain tags don't even require character data, as we've seen with the self-closing tags. Not all tags are going to have attributes, and not all attributes are going to have values. So in that sense, it's a very flexible format. I would note that tags must always match. And by match, I mean they have to form a nesting relationship. So if you think of a Russian doll, you have little dolls that go inside the big doll. And you wouldn't put, you can't match up, a smaller doll with a bigger doll. In our case, you can't put a tag inside a smaller tag, a bigger tag inside a smaller tag, or vice versa. So if we look here at my example, you can open A, put B inside of it, close up B, put that inside the A tag. That's fine. But in the case of the second example, you can't close out the A tag before you've finished with the child tag. In this case, we close up the B tag after the A tag. So that's a nuance. Give me a second as my mouse is not working. All right, there we go. All right, XML comments. There are cases where you want to convey additional information about what you're providing to somebody. I've done that in some of my implementations where I felt it was important to specify, especially in long lists, where you might have thousands of, geographies, for example. It'd be nice to know that at this point, we're starting with polling locations. And then at another point, we're starting at split precincts. Now, you could look at the data and probably infer that, but the comments are more in your face. They're easier to pick out. So comments are freeform. You can put them anywhere. You can put a tag. I encourage you to comment away. It's not machine readable, so you're not going to be able to convey additional semantics, but you can provide context to a human interpreter about your data. Then we have entity references, which is a bit of a nuance. You might have heard of escaped characters. And essentially, this is when you have a delimiter, and that delimiter uses certain syntax, but you want to describe that syntax as data. So in XML, an ampersand is part of the XML syntax. Well, how do we use an ampersand in a data context? And the example here is a road that's at an intersection point at 64 and 107. So if you look at the top example, you'll see this ampersand AMP semicolon that will instruct anybody consuming the data to replace that entity with a actual ampersand. The same with less than and greater than signs. Those are reserved by XML. So you have to use this ampersand semicolon syntax, and I've got 5 examples on the right. Do a quick demo of a tool you can use to view XML data. And I had it ready, but then I had to reboot my computer, so just bear with me. All right, here we go. This tool is called XML Notepad. And what I like about this is you don't have to deal with the syntax of XML to view an XML file. You can see that it's arranged as a tree because, like I said, XML is a tree. But in this case, you can just navigate along, and on the left-hand side, you have the tags. On the right-hand side, you have the content. So easy enough. If I want to look at a candidate's ballot name, we can do that. You can also see the use of attributes here. So anything with these red dots is an attribute. Anything with a blue dot is a tag. So it does describe the syntax, but in a little bit of a nicer format. There are a lot of XML tools that you can use. XML Spy is a popular one, Oxygen XML, as well as just Notepad or Notepad++. Those will allow you to display XML. But in this case, it's just nice to have something where you're not weighed down by all the syntax of XML, or in the case of a poorly formatted file, having the need to format it yourself or dig out particular data points. So I'll go back to the presentation. Hope everybody likes my ringtone. Somebody from Amazon just dropped off a package. All right, so I would like to have more webinars in the future. And the question is, what are useful topics to cover? We've covered XML today. We also have 2 recorded webinars on use cases for the common data formats, as well as voter records interchange, which is a common data format for voter registration data. I'm considering the webinars about the particular CDFs as the conceptual track, because they're getting into the concepts and the relationships of the data and what you can express with the common data formats, but they're not getting into the implementation details so much. So what I'm proposing we start is this technology track, which would go into more implementation details, starting with XML schema, which would describe the data types, how they're represented in XML, how you validate using a XML schema validator, some of the tooling you could use, how to do exports in your system in XML, how you can ingest XML, as well as other topics. So at this point, I will ask if there's any questions and allow everyone to unmute. All right, if you have a question, hit *7 or click on the mute icon on the Amazon Chime interface.
Yeah, so this is Stephanie. Yeah, I have a question, and I've been asking it long enough and not quite getting an answer. So that makes me think that I'm missing some basic point about CDFs. So I would love to understand what that is, and maybe it's that I'm more interested in data storage than data transfer. So what I'm wondering is whether there's a formal way to make my storage compatible or consistent with the CDF, or to confirm that my storage is compatible with the CDF.
Yeah, so that's actually something I'm actively working on. And I think, Stephanie, I shared with you a prototype of exports of relational data definition language where you could actually create a relational schema off of the common data formats. That would get you fairly close to compatibility. The only thing I would note is there's no recognized mapping between JSON and XML, XML and relational, JSON and relational. So as far as ingesting the data, that's always going to be something that you're going to have to create your own mapping for, as well as exporting.
Right.
But by having the data points very similar, and by storing all the data that could potentially be stored in a CDF, you're that much closer. I hope that helps.
Yeah. So if I understand, I think I'm understanding that where the rubber meets the road is that if I can take data from an XML feed and get it into my database, and I can likewise take data from my database and put it into an XML feed that obeys where both the feeds obey the common data format, then everything's cool. And that's as good as that's the standard. There isn't anything really better than that.
Right. So these formats were ultimately about interoperability, right? So it was always intended for this to be more of an interstitial format where you'd be going from vendor A's system to vendor B's system. In that case, having a relational representation or a more durable representation wasn't something we thought about, but it does seem like there's interest in that. And I think it's very easy to do. So in the next few weeks, I hope to be able to share that materials with you. I believe I have exports for both SQL Server and Oracle. And I think Postgres is pretty close to Oracle, so hopefully you'll be able to run that and play with it. Any other questions?
Hey, John, this is Herb. John Wack mentioned there were states that are accepting the 1500-100 format currently. What are they?
What are the states that are accepting the 1500-100? I know of states that are exporting. As far as importing back in.
Who's exporting? I mean, Wisconsin, I know is attempting to come up with a standard to use it, but it was really 1500-100 was really meant for results reporting. So who was accepting that for results reporting?
Hey, Herb. John here. What I meant there really is not accepting, a 1500 feed into their election management system necessarily, but I'm talking more about exporting and using it for election results reporting. I see. Since you mentioned that, I mean, when we were working on it, we recognized that all the data that you could potentially put in an exported feed of election results is really the same data that you might want to draw in at the very beginning of the election cycle to define the election and define the ballot. So I've always felt like election results reporting is maybe not the right name for the specification, because you can also use it for, election definition.
Agreed. There is maybe there's a high degree of overlap between the information you need for coding an election and for reporting the results. I don't know. You have to do a little bit of a gap analysis to see what's needed that's not in 1500, 100 now. We're looking into that, and Wisconsin is looking into that, for instance, to use it as an input into the election definition.
Well, this is Sarah from Wisconsin.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. Well, Sarah, who's working on the Wisconsin project, at least. So what's interesting is we did kind of do it a little bit backwards of where I think John Wack was originally intending the format to go, because we are looking more at pre-election than we are at post-election. I think originally we thought that for something like the working group thought that for something like election night reporting, if we had this standard format, then systems could easily export these reports into their election night reporting software and stuff like that. But as a state that doesn't do statewide election night reporting at the state level, it's done at the county level for us. We have been exploring more what we can do with the pre-election. But, for states that want to use it for election night reporting, I think that was part of the big push in the original intent. And I think it also, we'd like to look at it for posting our certified results as well, because, there's more and more groups that really want to dig through certified results report data for analysis and things like that, and researchers and things like that. So there is a lot of potential to actually use this format for a lot of different things. So election results reporting is kind of the umbrella, but it is quite a bit bigger than that.
Yeah, but even though, right now, voting systems have to conform to different states' requirements for getting the results to the states. And every state has their own format. So that, I'm certainly interested in getting this widely accepted as a means of providing system results to the state, because right now we have to have proprietary formats for each one, which is a real pain especially when it comes to certification. Generally, these formats are created outside the certified system in order to be able to be adaptable without having to go through a year of certification before you can conform.
Well, I know we have a lot of election officials on this call, and maybe they can chime in if they agree or disagree, but I feel like that was out of necessity. It wasn't that every locality's IT department or state's IT department said, oh, we can do it better. We want to do our own data format. I think it was that the data formats that were there were not constructed in a way that could be readily used by the systems that the localities were using, or even maybe we're missing data points. If it's missing data points and you need to get a data point out of the system, it's going to be a custom report. So yeah, the hope is that election results reporting and cast vote records, maybe to a lesser extent, will be able to convey all of the details that a locality would need, and they wouldn't roll their own data format.
I'm not talking about the localities. I'm talking about at the state level. They're mandating.
States or localities. Any other questions?
Well, this is Sarah one more time. I was just going to add that, if we're able to successfully do some of this interoperability between for example, ES&S's voting system and the systems we use at the state, both for election setup, but as well as for, ingesting election results and stuff like that. If we're able to successfully do that, I do think that sets up some opportunities for other states to be able to do something similar. So, the thing with standards is we kind of have to start. I think we all agree that if there was a canned way to do this, it would be certainly easier for voting system vendors who right now have to produce result reports in, 50 different formats, for each different state to be able to be ingested into, in order to make interoperability work. So I think there's really huge potential in this, obviously not just for Wisconsin, but for other states to try to make things easier. And I feel like that dovetails nicely with VVSG 2.0 too, because if system vendors need to make changes and need to be able to support interoperability via the common data format, it just makes it that much easier to plug into the common data format instead of rolling your own format as well. But for all the states that already built all their stuff, no one wants to have to rewrite things. So I think as we see people doing upgrades and things, I think that will, those are really ripe opportunities to maybe try to plug into this much more efficient pathway. Oh, and
certainly establishes a migration path.
Yeah. Well, Franklin Smith just made a note on the chat that I'm just going to call out because I think this is super exciting in that we've achieved interoperability between the 1500-100, that election results reporting pre-election feed, and the new VIP version 5 schema. So we know this stuff works. And for all you VIP states that are on here, I think that once you've got one, it's really easy to do the other. And then you can build one thing and use it for multiple purposes. But Franklin, if you want to say more about that, go right ahead.
No, thanks, Sarah. I think that's a good summary. So thank you.
Yeah, really to that point, as far as getting implementation, it's a bit of a dance, right? So the vendors under VVSG 2.0 are going to have a bit of a stick, and if it doesn't change, but the localities need to actually want it as well. So they will need to produce the ingestion routines as well as maybe produce their own data in this format for pre-election use cases, similar to VIP. So I hope that this webinar has been helpful to at least get you comfortable with looking at a XML feed. I know that it can be a little wonky at times to look at XML, but hopefully this has given you a additional comfort level with XML as well as the CDFs. Like I said, down the road, I would like to do additional webinars on more complicated topics like XML schema, which really gets into the nitty-gritty of, how you represent certain data types in XML, how things map from the CDFs onto XML. More examples, of course. I think everybody likes a good example. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to wrap up. Well, I am seeing a couple things in the comments here. Okay. There's a comment saying, what do you think is the best way to convert election results from states to the XML format consistent with CDF? So the problem with tabular formats like CSV, maybe to a lesser extent with Excel, because you could have multiple worksheets, is they're so flat, it's very hard to represent data in a concise manner. So, if you think of, contests and candidates, and I want to represent the results in a particular race, well, I'm going to repeat the contest name every time I report on a particular candidate. And then if you add more factors like groups, you're going to repeat both the candidate and the contest for each group. And then you start adding precincts and breakdowns of reporting. So starting with CSV, it's very hard to get to 1500-100 easily. I would say if you have a relational database that's storing this information, you should be able to get an approximation because you have more rich data types and relationships in a relational database. It's not to say it's not doable, but I wouldn't expect a complete or maybe even valid feed from a CSV. There's just not enough data there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I thank everybody for their time. A recording of this will be made available in the coming days. And those of you who said you wanted to stay up to date as far as new webinars and when they come out, we will be sending you an invite to the next webinar, hopefully in the next month or two. Thanks again, and thanks to John Wack for co-hosting with me. Take care, guys.